Let's fire up Blender and create some procedural landscapes. First, make sure you're using the Cycles render engine, and if you have a graphics card, select the GPU compute option, as it will significantly help to speed up the rendering. Now, add a plane to the scene and scale it along the X and Y axes. Then, with the plane selected, go to the Modifiers tab and add a subdivision surface modifier. Set the mode to simple and increase the subdivision levels for both viewport and render up to the maximum limit of 6. Of course, higher subdivision levels means that you will get more details on the landscape and better looking results. However, don't go overboard if your computer can't handle it. My computer is a normal mid-range system. However, it can still handle another 3 levels of subdivision on top of the initial 6 without slowing down or crashing. This plane will be the canvas for a procedural texture, so go to the Materials tab, create a new material and set a name for it. Then, make sure to expand the settings of the material and select Displacement and Bump from the drop-down list. Now, head over to the Shading viewport, where I will show you how to set up a single procedural shader that you can use to generate a variety of landscapes simply by changing its parameters. Here are some examples. Here, we don't need all the properties of the principled BSDF shader for a procedural texture, so delete it. And instead, using the Add menu, let's drop in Blender's Glossy shader, along with a Bump node and a Noise texture node. This sequence of nodes will create very small bumps for the procedural texture. Set the color of the glossy shader to your liking, and slide the roughness all the way to the maximum value of 1. For the bump node, use a low value for the strength, as these bumps are meant to be the least prominent property of the procedural texture. Also, set the scale of the noise texture to a large value to have the bumps represent the smaller details of the surface of our landscape. And by that, I mean those details small enough that are only visible up close. Now, to add some more prominent displacements to our landscape, let's add a texture coordinate node, a noise texture node, a mix RGB node, a Voronoi texture node, a map range node, and finally a displacement node. The Voronoi texture node generates the most prominent displacements of our procedural texture. From its drop-down list, select Smooth F1 and the Minkowski option. As for the scale and smoothness parameters, you can use these to give the landscape a soft or harsh look. The map range node, on the other hand, is where you can adjust the magnitude and therefore the prominence of these displacements. Later, we'll be using the parameters of the map range node to generate different types of landscapes. The displacement node is where height values that were generated through previous nodes are converted to actual displacements and then applied to the vertices of the model. Keep in mind that the mid-level parameter defines the baseline for the displacements. The combination of the noise texture node and the mix RGB node allows us to distort the UV coordinates provided by the texture coordinate node. The size of the distortions is determined by the parameters of the noise texture node, while the intensity of the distortions is set using the slider on the mix RGB node. Later on, we will use the parameters of these two nodes as we generate a variety of procedural landscapes. Now, to add another, somewhat larger layer of displacements to our landscape, let's add a texture coordinate node, a noise texture node, a map range node, and a math node. The noise texture node determines the level of detail for this layer of displacements. Set the noise texture node to 4D so that later we can randomize the results. On the other hand, the map range node is used to set the magnitude of these displacements. Finally, the math node has the simple but important job of combining the displacements produced by the two branches of our procedural shader. Later, we will use the parameters of these two nodes as we generate a variety of procedural landscapes. Before we go further, it's best that we organize our shader as to avoid any confusion down the line. To do this, let's use the Add menu to create a frame. We can then select a group of nodes and drag them onto the frame. This will automatically resize the frame according to the layout of the nodes. I'm going to place two separate frames here, one for each branch of node that I had created in the previous steps. You can give each frame a name by right-clicking on the frame and selecting the Rename option. Here, I've appropriately named the frames Micro and Macro Displacements. With that out of the way, let's quickly switch over to the Layout viewport, where we are now going to create a body of water for our landscape. To do this, add a cube to the scene and resize it along the X, Y, and Z axes. Then, go to the Materials tab and create a new material for this body of water. Next, with the cube selected, switch back to the Shading viewport. Here, delete Blender's principled BSDF shader and using the Add menu, replace it with the principled Volume shader. Make sure to connect the output of this shader node to the volume input of the material. For the color of the volume shader, I would suggest a highly saturated value to get a more appealing result. And for the density of the volume, a value of 10 works fine. Keep in mind that the advantage of using a volume shader instead of a surface shader is that it adds a sense of depth to the body of water. Now, going back to the procedural texture we created a bit earlier, let me point out these particular nodes and specifically their parameters. These are the parameters of our procedural texture, and as I have repeatedly mentioned from the start of the video, we can create a variety of landscapes just by changing the parameters of this single shader setup. Here are some examples, along with their parametric values. Feel free to test any combination you can imagine. One of them might just surprise you. If you want to learn more about procedurally generated textures, consider watching these other videos. As for this one, thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.